Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most deceptively quiet eras, the 1970s American suburb. On the surface, it looked like everything was fine. The lawns were mowed, the casseroles were bubbling, and the station wagons were parked at perfect right angles in the driveways. But behind those avocado green kitchen walls, something was happening. Women were sneaking cigarettes over the sink, passing around books that made their husbands nervous, joining consciousness-raising groups in living rooms that still smelled faintly of pledge, and quietly, steadily, reinventing their entire lives, one jello mould at a time. Before we get into it, a massive thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly you understood the assignment. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. The channel is also now on Spotify, so if you want to drift off to this on your commute, or while pretending to fold laundry, there's a link in the description. Now go ahead and dim the lights, turn on a fan, pull the blanket up, get horizontal. You've earned it. Because tonight we need to ask some questions. Did 1970s suburban wives actually enjoy fondue, or were they just performing fondue? What exactly was happening at the neighbourhood Tupperware party that took 3 hours and left everyone looking slightly changed? Was the book club really about the book? What did a woman do all day in a house that was already clean, in a town where everyone had the same curtains? Did she ever just sit in the driveway and think about her entire life? And what happened when she started thinking a little too hard? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1973. You're a 34-year-old woman in a split-level home in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Your husband left for work 40 minutes ago. The kids are at school, the dishes are done, the house is quiet, and you're standing in the kitchen in your housecoat, staring at a calendar, wondering if this is it, or if something is about to change. Spoiler: something is absolutely about to change. The alarm went off at 6:15, and it wasn't for her. It was for him, her husband, who needed coffee, a pressed shirt, and enough eggs to sustain a man who was about to spend 8 hours sitting in an air-conditioned office. By the time he backed the Buick out of the driveway, she had already been awake for 45 minutes, operated a stove, located 2 school shoes that were not in the same room, and signed a permission slip she'd never read. The morning wasn't hers. It was a service she provided quietly and without applause before her actual day had technically started. She poured herself a cup of what was left in the percolator, sat down at the kitchen table, and for approximately 4 minutes experienced something close to peace. The coffee was lukewarm and slightly over-extracted because the percolator had been sitting on low heat since 6, but she drank it anyway, because this was not a moment for standards, this was a moment for sitting down. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet after a small storm has passed through it. Cereal bowls were in the sink. A juice glass had been left on the counter 6 inches from the dishwasher, which was a choice someone had made deliberately, and she had decided not to address. The table had a smear of jelly on it that she would wipe in a moment. Not yet. In a moment. This was her morning, such as it was. The 12 minutes between the last goodbye and the beginning of the actual work. She did not call it free time because it wasn't free exactly. It was borrowed. It was the pause between one set of tasks and the next, distinguished from the rest of the day only by the fact that no one was actively asking her for anything in it. The work of the morning had been substantial. She had made breakfast for 3 separate people who all wanted slightly different things and expressed their preferences in the whining register that children reserve for the hours before 8. She had found the permission slip, which had been inside a backpack pocket that she'd been told was empty. She'd ironed a shirt that had been left on the bathroom floor as a kind of optimistic suggestion. She'd done all of this while also being mentally present enough to notice that one of the kids seemed quiet in a way that might mean something, or might mean nothing, and she'd made a note in some internal file she maintained for exactly that kind of observation. Modern life has a version of this: the morning scroll, the coffee that gets reheated 3 times, the gradual negotiation with consciousness before the day demands full participation. But here is the difference. She did not ease into her morning. She ran someone else's morning from the moment she opened her eyes, and then, when it was over, sat alone with the residue of it, and called those 12 minutes her own. There was no gym, there was no quiet meditation practice. There was the kitchen table, the lukewarm coffee, and the jelly smear she was going to deal with in a minute. And yet, there was something she did in those 12 minutes that was more valuable than it looked. She thought. Not productively, not toward any goal, just thought. The way a person does when no one is talking at them and the immediate emergency has passed. She thought about something she'd read. She thought about something the woman from 2 streets over had said at the block party. She thought about herself, briefly and without agenda. The way you only can when the house is empty and the coffee is in your hand and the permission slip is signed and the car is gone, and for just a moment, the morning belongs to you. Then she wiped the jelly off the table and started on the dishes. The house was the dream, except nobody had asked her to describe the dream first. It was a 3-bedroom ranch with a carport and a back patio that got afternoon shade, selected by 2 people but really chosen by 1, during a season of life when she was pregnant and said yes to most things because the alternative required energy she didn't have. The avocado green appliances had not been her idea. Neither had the carpet colour, which the realtor called harvest gold, and which she privately thought looked like anxiety given physical form. But it was hers in a way that nothing else entirely was, a space she had furnished, arranged, cleaned, and willed into something livable, which meant she felt about it the way you feel about a project you didn't ask for but finished beautifully. The house had a logic to it that she had imposed over time. The furniture was in positions that made sense to her, even if they were not the positions it had arrived in. The bookshelf was organised in a way that looked casual but wasn't. The kitchen had a system, not a written system, just the accumulated logic of years of doing the same tasks efficiently, and when someone disrupted it by putting a spatula in the wrong drawer, she felt it the way you feel a stone in a shoe. Small, specific, and disproportionately irritating. This was the paradox of the 1970s suburban home. It was entirely her domain, and entirely not her choice. She managed it the way a talented administrator manages an institution she did not found, with competence, genuine investment, and a low-grade awareness that she had not designed the terms of her own expertise. She was very good at this. She was very good at things nobody gave her a title for. The neighbourhood itself was a version of the same paradox, scaled up. The suburb had been built in the late 1950s with a specific vision in mind. Young families, fresh starts, identical lawns maintained at identical heights, by men who appeared on weekends with identical mowers. She had arrived in it in the mid-60s and had been here long enough now that the newness had worn off, and what remained was just the place where her life happened. She knew its rhythms. She knew the sound the Henderson's dog made at 11 every night. She knew which stretch of sidewalk heaved in winter and would catch a wheel if you weren't paying attention. In some parallel universe, someone had asked her at 20 what she wanted, not what she wanted in a husband or a neighbourhood, but what she wanted to do, to build, to become, and she had answered, and the answer had been taken seriously. In this universe, that conversation had not happened. What had happened was a sequence of reasonable decisions that had each made sense in the moment, and had together produced this kitchen, this carpet, this life. It was not a bad life. She was not performing unhappiness she didn't feel. But there was a specific thing, a question she was starting to ask more clearly as the decade moved forward, which was whether the life she was living was one she would have chosen, if choosing had ever really been on the table. The avocado green refrigerator hummed. The harvest gold carpet stretched down the hallway. Outside, the neighbour's sprinkler started up at precisely 8:45 as it always did. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it, and she thought, I am going to rearrange this living room. It was a start. At 8:47 the bus came. She watched from the door, waved, closed the door, and stood in the hallway for a long moment listening to the silence. It was a specific kind of silence, not peaceful, exactly, but waited. The house was now hers for approximately 6 hours, which sounds like freedom, until you realise that the house was also full of dishes, laundry, 3 rooms that needed vacuuming, a bathroom that needed scrubbing, and a refrigerator whose contents she had to somehow convert into dinner by 6. She had what theoretically looked like a day off. It was not a day off. It was a day in which no one was watching her do the work, which is a completely different thing. The cleaning came first because it always came first, not because she had made a philosophical commitment to morning cleaning, but because the house looked its worst right after everyone left it, and she had found that she could not settle into anything else while it was in that state. It took approximately 2 hours to return the house to the condition it had been in before the people who lived in it had been in it, which is one of the more thankless features of domestic labour, that its primary achievement is the restoration of a baseline that will be immediately disrupted again. Think of it like that co-worker who fixes bugs in the code every night that someone else keeps reintroducing every morning. The job is invisible when it's done correctly, and the only evidence of its existence is what happens when it doesn't get done. By 11, the house was orderly. She made herself another cup of coffee, a real one this time, hot, unhurried, and sat down with whatever she was reading. Books were important to her in a way that had never really been catered to. She'd been a reader before she was a wife and before she was a mother, and reading had remained the part of herself that the architecture of her daily life had not fully absorbed. It was the one thing she did that was both entirely self-directed and entirely invisible to everyone around her, which made it feel, in some quiet way, like a private territory she had held on to. The afternoon had different textures depending on the day. There were errands, appointments, the 1,000 administrative tasks of running a household that don't make it onto any official list of duties because they are too small and too numerous to itemize. There was volunteering at the school library, which she had taken on because she liked books and because it got her out of the house on Thursdays in a way that felt purposeful rather than restless. There was the occasional phone call that lasted an hour and turned into something unexpectedly meaningful, and then, at around 2:30, the particular quality of the afternoon would shift, the light changing, the clock exerting a new kind of pressure as the bus return approached and the day pivoted back toward everyone else. She would put the book down, assess the refrigerator, begin the mental orchestration of dinner. The window of quiet would close. The service would resume. She did not resent it exactly, but she noticed the closing, and as the decade went on, she became increasingly interested in what it would look like to open it wider. The cul-de-sac was not just geography. It was a society with its own rules, hierarchies, alliances, and cold wars conducted entirely through the language of lawn maintenance and casserole drop-offs. She knew which neighbour let her dog do her business in other people's yards and pretended not to notice. She knew which marriage 2 doors down was in trouble, because the lights had been on until 2 a.m. 3 times last week. She knew who had a daughter applying to college and who was quietly dealing with something nobody was talking about yet. The suburb looked like a row of identical houses with identical mailboxes, but she could read it like a book she'd been given years to study, and she had memorized every page. The social architecture of the suburb was entirely informal and entirely rigid at the same time. There were no written rules about when you could knock on a neighbour's door, how long you could stay when you did, or what constituted an overstep in the complex economy of favours and reciprocity that held the cul-de-sac together, but everyone knew the rules, and violations were noted and stored. A woman who borrowed sugar twice without returning flour was generating a record. A woman who failed to bring a dish to the block party 2 years running was developing a reputation. None of this was ever said out loud. All of it was absolutely real. The social life of the suburb was in many ways her professional life, whether anyone called it that or not. She managed relationships, mediated conflicts, maintained information networks, and exercised the kind of soft diplomatic power that keeps organisations from flying apart at the seams. When the Miller's youngest broke the Hendersons' fence and neither family was speaking to the other, she was the one who brought a plate of cookies to both houses in the same afternoon, and said nothing specific and solved the problem anyway. In a different context, this skill set had a name and a salary. Here, it had neither. The friendships were real, though. Underneath the social machinery, genuine warmth between women who had ended up in the same place at the same time and had built something between them. She had a friend across the street who she had known for 9 years, and with whom she had the specific intimacy of shared proximity and shared season. They had been pregnant at the same time, had stood in each other's kitchens during bad weeks, had driven each other's children places without keeping score. That friendship was not nothing. It was in many ways the best part of the suburb. But the suburb also had a ceiling, and she was becoming aware of it as the decade progressed. The social universe of the cul-de-sac was warm and real and sufficient for certain things and insufficient for others. It didn't have room for certain kinds of ambition, certain kinds of questions, certain conversations that pressed on the edges of the agreed-upon version of what life here was supposed to look like. When she started asking those questions, she would need to find somewhere else to ask them. But she was not there yet. For now, she waved to the neighbour across the street and noted that the woman's hydrangeas looked better than hers, which she was going to do something about, and walked back inside to start the afternoon's work. In 1973, if you were a wife at home, you were reachable. There was no out of office, there was no going dark. The phone was on the wall in the kitchen, and it rang, and you answered it, because not answering the phone was not yet a personality trait. It was just something strange people did. She answered for her mother-in-law, for the school nurse, for the paediatrician's reminder calls, for a woman from church who needed someone to talk to and had decided that someone was her. She answered in the middle of scrubbing a pot, in the middle of a thought she'd been having for 3 days and couldn't quite finish, in the middle of the only 11 minutes of quiet she'd found all week. The world did not schedule itself around her interiority. It never had. The telephone was both a lifeline and a leash, and in the 1970s it was mounted to the kitchen wall as if to make the point architecturally. You could move around the kitchen while you talked, but only as far as the cord would stretch, which was about 4 feet, which was far enough to stir something on the stove but not far enough to actually leave. She'd spent entire afternoons tethered to that wall, listening, responding, being available to her mother, to other mothers, to organisations that required a woman's volunteer labour, and had learned that the best time to call was during the day, because that was when she would be home. There is a modern version of this that everyone will recognise, the email that arrives at 10 at night, the expectation of immediate response, the sense that your attention is a resource that others have standing claims on. But there is a difference, and the difference is that she had no competing professional obligations that could reasonably be cited as cause for not picking up. She was home. The phone was ringing. The logic was airtight and also quietly maddening. What she wanted, what she had occasionally in those 12 minutes after the Buick left and before the day began, was uninterrupted time inside her own head. Not to be productive with it necessarily, though she had plenty she could do with it. just to have it, just to be in a room without being available in it. This is not a radical desire. It is in fact the most basic unit of a person's inner life. Time that belongs to them rather than to whoever happens to need something. The irony is that she was surrounded by time and had almost none of it. The hours between 9 and 3 looked, from the outside, like a vast expanse of personal freedom. They were not. They were a series of interlocking obligations, each small enough to be dismissed individually, each one adding its small claim to the day until the day was fully allocated. And threaded through all of it, mounted to the kitchen wall, was the phone. She answered it every time. She would for years. But she was starting quietly to notice what answering it cost her, which is not the same as resenting it, but is the necessary first step towards something else. Nobody talks about this, but the grocery store was one of the few places she could go alone, in public, and have it considered completely reasonable. Nobody questioned the grocery run. Nobody said, "Where are you going? How long will you be? Do you really need to?" She got in the station wagon, drove to the Kroger or the A&P, and spent 45 minutes to an hour in a fluorescent-lit building where she was anonymous, unhurried, and technically performing a household duty while also just walking around by herself, which is all she sometimes wanted. She'd linger in the magazine aisle longer than the shopping justified. She'd read the back of products she had no intention of buying. She'd have a thought that was entirely her own, complete it, and carry it back to the car like something she'd found on a shelf. The grocery store in the early 1970s was a particular kind of place, bigger than it had been a decade earlier, more aggressively abundant, stocked with products that arrived in a constant stream of new packaging and competing claims. There was a whole aisle dedicated to things that had not existed as grocery categories 10 years prior. Convenience foods, frozen meals in section trays, cake mixes in 17 varieties. The store was a document of the era, of a country selling women time-saving products, while simultaneously denying them time. She navigated it with the expertise of someone who'd been doing this twice a week for years. She knew the layout, knew which checkout line moved faster, knew that the produce by the entrance looked better than it tasted. She had opinions about brands that she had developed through long experience, and held with more certainty than she held opinions about some things that were supposed to matter more. She was, in this context, an expert, and she moved through the space with the particular ease of someone operating in their area of mastery. But the real value of the grocery run was not the groceries. It was the 20-minute drive each way, alone in the car with the radio, which in the early 1970s was playing things that she found either irritating or unexpectedly moving, sometimes within the same 15-minute block. It was the hour in a public space where no one needed her for anything, and she could compose herself, assemble her thoughts, experience her own preferences, simply exist in the world as an individual rather than as a function. She took longer than necessary in the cereal aisle because she genuinely could not decide, and also because she was not in a hurry, and also because the decision was entirely hers and that remained, even years into this routine, a quietly satisfying fact. She chose based on her own criteria. There was no one looking over her shoulder. In the grand landscape of her daily life, this was a minor freedom. She valued it accordingly, which is to say, more than was perhaps proportional, because proportional had nothing to do with it. She pushed the cart toward the checkout, the week's meals assembled inside it, and felt something loosen in her that had been held tight since morning. She would drive home, unload the bags, and the house would resume its claims. But for a moment in the parking lot with the engine running, and the radio still on, she sat. Just for a moment. Then she drove home. She subscribed to 3 of them: Good Housekeeping, McCall's, and one that had recently started running articles that made her feel vaguely like she was standing at an open window. The magazines arrived in the mailbox and were officially about recipes, beauty routines, and tips for removing ring around the collar, with a product that sponsored the adjacent page. But by the early 1970s, something had shifted in the editorial rooms, and she could feel it in the pages without quite naming it. An article would appear between the casserole spreads and the shoe polish advertisements, something about what women wanted, what women were allowed to want, what women were beginning to say out loud in rooms when nobody was taking notes. She read those articles twice. The magazine had always been a complicated object in the life of the suburban woman. It was, on the surface, aspirational, full of homes slightly nicer than hers, meals slightly more elaborate than she had time to make, women slightly more composed than she felt on a Tuesday morning, with wet laundry in the machine and a school meeting at 3. It sold a version of domestic life as achievement, as aesthetic, as something that could be perfected with the right product and sufficient effort. She'd been reading it long enough to understand the machinery of it. She read it anyway. But something was changing in the early 70s, and the magazines were both reflecting it, and gently, cautiously, pushing on it. McCall's ran a piece on women returning to the workforce in 1972 that had more depth than the headline suggested. Good Housekeeping, of all places, began running first-person essays from women who were asking questions the magazine had never previously made room for. And then there was Ms. Magazine, which launched in 1972, and which was not trying to tell her how to remove a stain, which was, in fact, not interested in the stain at all, and which felt, from its first issue, like a different kind of conversation entirely. She read Ms., the way you read something you know is going to cost you something, with attention, with a slight sense of the ground shifting, with the awareness that certain ideas, once introduced, do not quietly leave. It was not comfortable reading. It was the kind of reading that caused her to put the magazine down and stare at the kitchen wall for a minute before picking it up again. The advertising in all 3 magazines was its own kind of document. Products sold on the premise that her value was located in the cleanliness of her floors and the freshness of her breath and the speed with which she could produce a meal. She had internalized these premises for years without fully articulating them as premises. Reading them side by side with articles about women's liberation created a particular kind of cognitive dissonance. The same page that told her she was important told her she was important primarily as a surface. She began to notice this. Noticing it was, it turned out, irreversible. She renewed all 3 subscriptions. She kept Ms. at the bottom of the pile, not from shame, but from a kind of private deliberateness. It was hers. It was asking something of her. She wanted to read it on her own terms, without commentary, in the quiet hours when the house was hers and the window was open, and she had enough space inside herself to hear what it was saying. It started with the neighbour, who had a friend who knew a woman who'd been to one in Chicago, and by the time the idea had travelled 3 houses down and across a back fence, there were 6 of them sitting in a living room on a Wednesday night with wine in the good glasses and the very specific energy of people about to say things they'd been carrying in their pockets for years. Nobody called it a consciousness-raising group out loud at first. It was just getting together, just talking. But the things they talked about, the way their lives had narrowed without anyone announcing a narrowing, the things they'd given up so quietly they'd almost forgotten they'd had them, landed in that room with the weight of something long overdue. She drove home afterward and sat in the parked car for 5 minutes before going inside. Consciousness-raising groups had been spreading through American suburbs since the late 1960s, mostly through the same informal networks that spread. Everything through neighbours, through friends of friends, through a mention at the end of a phone call that turned into an invitation that turned into a Wednesday night that turned into a standing arrangement. They had no formal structure, no official affiliation, no curriculum. They were just women in a room agreeing to tell each other the truth, which sounds modest, and was not. The format, such as it was, involved going around the room and speaking from personal experience, not debating, not theorizing, not offering advice, just saying what her life actually looked and felt like from the inside. This sounds easy. It was for most of them the most difficult thing they had done in years. They had spent so long translating their experience into acceptable form, into cheerfulness, into competence, into the polished surface of a life that looked the way a life was supposed to look, that speaking from underneath that surface felt like a different language that they were rusty in. But they did it. One woman said that she had not finished a sentence in 3 years without being interrupted and had started doing it to herself preemptively. Another said that she had been accepted to a graduate program before her marriage and had never told her husband about the letter. A third said she could not remember the last time she had made a decision that was only about her. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet ones, which made them heavier. She told them about the morning routine. She told them about the phone. She told them about the thoughts she'd been having for 3 days that she kept not getting to finish. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true has been said in them. Nobody tried to fix it. Nobody said at least or well you should or have you tried. They just listened, which was the agreement, and which was also the thing that most of them had not been offered enough of in years. She drove home through the dark suburb and sat in the driveway and looked at the lit windows of the house. Inside, her husband watching the news, the children asleep, the dishes done, everything in its place. She had been gone for 2 hours. Nothing had broken. The house had managed without her, which she had suspected intellectually and now knew actually. She sat with that for a moment and then went inside. She would go back next Wednesday, and the one after that. The feminine mystique had come out in 1963, but it was still circulating in the suburbs a decade later, the way certain important things circulate, quietly, passed hand to hand, recommended in lowered voices. She'd borrowed a copy from the woman in the consciousness-raising group, read it in portions during the quiet hours, and experienced the strange sensation of a book describing her life more accurately than she had ever described it herself. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was, in fact, the opposite, the specific discomfort of recognition, of seeing something you'd been trying not to look at rendered in clear, unsparing language. She didn't hide it because she was ashamed. She put it under the bed because she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet, and she needed to finish it first. Betty Friedan had called it the problem that has no name, which was precisely why it hit the way it did. She had felt the thing for years without having language for it. The gap between the life she was living and something she couldn't quite articulate. The sense of a ceiling she hadn't known was there until she stood up and found it. Friedan named it, and naming it did not fix it, but it did something almost as significant. It made her feel that she'd not invented it, that she was not defective, that the thing she'd been feeling in the kitchen on Tuesday mornings was not a personal failure, but a structural condition that millions of other women were also feeling in their own kitchens, in their own suburbs across the country. This was, it turned out, enormously important. The isolation of the suburb was partly geographic and partly psychological, the sense that whatever was wrong was locally, specifically, personally wrong, a problem with her rather than with the arrangement. The book dissolved that isolation. It said, "You're not alone in this room. You're not even unusual in this room. The room is the problem." Gloria Steinem arrived in her awareness slightly later, through Ms. Magazine and television appearances that she watched with the peculiar attention she reserved for people who seemed to be saying things that mattered. Steinem was not Friedan, younger, different in approach, speaking to a slightly different moment, but the effect was similar. The sense of a larger conversation that she was part of, whether she had formally joined it or not. She finished The Feminine Mystique on a Thursday afternoon, closed it, and held it in her lap for a while. Then she put it under the bed, not to hide it, but to keep it close while she decided what to do with it. She thought about the woman in the Wednesday group who'd been accepted to graduate school and had never told her husband about the letter. She thought about the morning routine and the phone and the 4 minutes of lukewarm coffee. She thought about the harvest gold carpet she'd not chosen. She was not about to blow up her life. She was not a dramatic person, and besides she had children, and a husband who was not a bad man, and a life that had real things in it worth keeping. But something had clarified, the way things clarify when you finally have a word for them. She reached under the bed and got the book back out. She had some pages she wanted to reread. Some of them went back to work, not with a declaration but with a Tuesday. She mentioned she'd seen a listing at the dentist's office for a receptionist, said she thought she might call, and then she called, and then she had a job, and the house did not collapse. Dinner still happened, the laundry got done, just on a slightly different schedule. The children survived. What changed was harder to articulate, something about the way she moved through the afternoon, the way she had a reason to put on different shoes, the way her brain was occupied with something that paid and had a name and existed outside the 4 walls she'd been moving through for years. She didn't frame it as a statement. She framed it as a thing she was doing, and then she kept doing it. The job was 3 mornings a week, 9 to 1, answering phones and scheduling appointments, and managing the front desk of a dental practice run by a man named Dr. Kellerman, who was pleasant and organised and treated her like a competent adult, which she had not been treated as in a professional context in so many years that the experience was briefly disorienting and then straightforwardly wonderful. She was good at it immediately, because the skills it required, organisation, telephone management, the ability to deal with anxious people calmly and efficiently, were skills she'd been developing and deploying without recognition for the better part of a decade. By 1970, more than 40% of American women were in the workforce. The image of the permanently domestic suburban housewife was already, statistically, a partial fiction, but it was a fiction with enough cultural weight that returning to work still felt, to many women, like a decision that required justification. She did not particularly justify it. She said she was going back to work and named the hours, and said dinner would be at 6:30 instead of 6 on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. The children accepted this with the equanimity of children, which is to say they barely noticed. Her husband had a period of adjustment. This is the diplomatic way of saying that he asked more than once whether it was really necessary and whether she was sure it was worth the disruption, and who would handle things if one of the kids got sick during the day. She answered these questions with patience because they were not unreasonable questions, and also with a quiet steadiness that made it clear she was not asking his permission. She had already called. She already had the job. These were logistical questions, not philosophical ones, and she was happy to address them logistically. What she did not tell him, because she did not yet fully have words for it, was what it felt like to walk into the dental practice on the first morning in a blouse she had ironed that was for somewhere else, and to be introduced to people who knew nothing about her, yet except that she was the new receptionist, and she seemed capable, to be unknown, to be allowed to become competent gradually, in front of people for whom her competence was new information. To receive a check at the end of the first week that represented something she had earned in a context that existed independent of her marriage and her household and her children. She held the check for a moment before depositing it. It was not a large check. It did not change the financial arithmetic of the household in any significant way. But it was hers, which was its own arithmetic entirely, and she did the math on it privately and found it added up to something she had not had before and intended to keep. Without the babysitter, none of the rest of it happened. The babysitter, usually a teenager from 2 streets over who charged 50 cents an hour and ate all the crackers, was the quiet infrastructure of the 1970s suburban woman's emerging independence. She paid for her out of her own money, which she had started keeping in a separate envelope in the kitchen drawer, which nobody asked about, which was itself a kind of quiet revolution. The babysitter made the night class possible. The babysitter made the evening meeting possible. The babysitter made the 3 hours she spent sitting in a diner with a friend talking without interruption possible. She tipped generously and felt no guilt about it, which was its own new feeling. The economics of the babysitter were simple, and the implications were not. 50 cents an hour, sometimes 75 if the teenager was reliable, and good with the kids and didn't leave the kitchen looking like a minor weather event had passed through it. She kept the envelope in the second drawer, under the takeout menus, and she added to it from her own earnings and subtracted from it deliberately, and tracked it in her head with the same quiet precision she brought to everything domestic. Nobody had told her to keep a separate envelope. She just started doing it. The way you start doing things when you realise that having your own resources, however modest, is different in kind from having access to shared ones. The babysitter's name was usually something like Diane or Karen or Patty, and she was 15 or 16 and arrived in a coat and immediately turned on the television and was perfectly adequate with the children, who liked her because she let them stay up 20 minutes later than they were supposed to and didn't tell anyone. She was, in her quiet teenage way, a co-conspirator in the project of the suburban woman's expanding life, though she would not have described it in those terms and was primarily motivated by the envelope. What the babysitter made possible was not just the specific activity she enabled, it was the psychological fact of having an exit. Before the envelope and the standing arrangement with Diane or Karen or Patty, every evening obligation required a negotiation. Was it important enough? Was it worth asking? Was the thing she wanted to go to the kind of thing that would be supported, or the kind that would generate a question she didn't want to answer? The envelope collapsed that negotiation. She had the means. She had the arrangement. She was going. The night class required her 2 evenings a week. The Wednesday group required her 1. The occasional dinner with a friend required her 1 more. That was 4 evenings a month that she was somewhere else, being someone who existed outside the house, which, spread across a month, sounds modest, and which felt, in the actual living of it, like the difference between a room with a window and a room without one. She noticed something else too. The children were fine. This seems obvious in retrospect, and at the time it was both obvious and not, because the premise she'd absorbed through years of ambient cultural messaging was that her presence was the load-bearing wall of the household, that things would begin to structurally fail in her absence. They did not fail. Dinner got made, just by someone else or slightly later. The children did their homework and went to bed. Her husband managed. The house stood. She filed this information away carefully. She would need it later, when the envelope got bigger and the exits got more frequent, and someone suggested, in a tone that was not quite a question, whether she was perhaps gone a bit much. She would think of those evenings. She would think of Diane, eating crackers on the couch, the kids asleep, the house entirely intact. And she would say, they were fine. They were always fine. 6 o'clock dinner was non-negotiable. This was understood. The meal was expected the way the news was expected, as a fixed point in the evening around which everything else arranged itself. She'd made 1,000 dinners by now, 10,000, and could execute a pot roast or a tuna noodle casserole on the level of pure muscle memory, which meant that while her hands were doing the work, her mind was entirely somewhere else. She thought about the article she'd read that afternoon. She thought about something the woman from the Wednesday group had said that she was still turning over. She thought, sometimes, about what she would have studied if she had studied, where she would have gone, who she would have become, not bitterly exactly, but with the curious, slightly careful feeling of someone examining something fragile. The dinner itself was a document of the era. 1970s. American suburban cooking occupied a specific cultural moment. the tail end of the casserole age, the dawn of the slow cooker, the brief and confusing reign of the Jell-O mould. She made things that involved cream of mushroom soup as a structural ingredient. She made things with tater tots on top, which her children loved and which she was privately neutral about. She made a beef stroganoff on Thursdays that had become so established in the family's routine that its absence would have been remarked upon, which is another way of saying that she had accidentally committed herself to a weekly obligation through the crime of being good at something. The kitchen in the evening had a different quality than the kitchen in the morning. The morning kitchen was functional, rushed, a staging area for people in transit. The evening kitchen was warmer, more domestic in the traditional sense, the smell of something cooking, the radio on low, the gradual assembly of a meal that would gather the family at the table for the one moment of the day when they were all in the same place at the same time. She valued the gathering even when she was tired of producing it. Think of it like a stage manager. She never appeared in the production, never took a bow, but nothing ran without her. The dinner existed. The table was set. The food was hot at precisely the right moment. The logistics of this, across years, represented an enormous quantity of invisible competence that registered in everyone's awareness only in its absence. On the evening she was sick, or the night's dinner was late, when the household's dependence on her management became suddenly, briefly visible before everyone adjusted and she recovered and the system resumed. What she thought about while making dinner was, in some ways, more interesting than the dinner. The cooking required enough of her physical attention to occupy her hands and not much more, leaving her mind free to go wherever it wanted. It went increasingly to the questions the Wednesday group had opened, to the article, to the night class, to the woman who had been accepted to graduate school and had never sent the letter saying yes, to herself, at 20, deciding not to finish the degree because the timing wasn't right, because there would be time later, because later was a country she had believed in completely, and which had turned out to be more complicated than advertised. She stirred the stroganoff. She checked the clock. She called the children in from wherever they were, with the specific volume and inflection that meant now, not in a minute. They came, he came, they sat down, and she served it, and they ate, and the table was full of voices and the easy noise of a family at dinner, which she loved, genuinely, without irony, without qualification. She loved this table. She was also becoming someone who needed more than this table. Both things were true, completely, at the same time. She passed the bread and thought about her night class and said yes when someone asked if there was more. Do not underestimate the Tupperware party. On the surface, it was a living room full of women handling plastic containers and learning about the burp seal, which is a real thing and was treated with genuine reverence. But what was actually happening in that room was commerce, community, and something adjacent to ambition. The women who hosted and sold Tupperware in the early 1970s were running small businesses in an era when the word businesswoman still sounded slightly unusual said out loud. They had products, pitches, commission structures, and sales targets. They had something to master and something to gain. The living room was a showroom. The burp seal demonstration was a close, and the hostess standing there in front of her neighbours with a storage container and a smile was learning that she was quite good at this, which was information she filed away. Tupperware had been sold through home parties since the early 1950s, when a woman named Brownie Wise had convinced the Tupperware company that the product would move better through social networks than through retail stores, that women would buy from women they knew, in spaces they trusted, through relationships rather than transactions. She was correct, and in being correct she had accidentally built something that looked like a housewife's gathering and operated like a sales force. By the early 1970s, Tupperware parties were generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. entirely through the labour and social capital of women who are classified, for tax purposes, as independent contractors rather than employees. She'd attended several before she hosted one herself, and what she noticed beyond the containers, which were genuinely useful, and the food, which was always good because everyone brought something, was how the room changed when a confident woman was running it. The hostess moved through the living room with a specific kind of ease. She knew her product, she knew her audience, she read the room and adjusted her pitch. She laughed at the right moments and let the silence sit at others. It was a performance, but it was also skill, and skill was visible even when the context minimized it. She hosted her first party in the fall of 1971. She invited 12 women and 11 came, which was a good number. She'd prepared more carefully than the occasion technically required, had thought about the order of the demonstration, had anticipated questions, had considered which products to lead with and which to introduce later once the room had warmed up. None of this was taught to her explicitly. She had just watched and paid attention, which were the two most useful things she knew how to do. The party went well. She sold enough to earn a meaningful commission and a catalogue of new products she could order for herself at discount, which was also genuinely useful. But what she carried out of the experience was something harder to quantify. The knowledge that she could stand in a room and hold it, that she could move people toward a decision through conversation and demonstration and relationship, that the skills she'd been exercising for years in the management of the cul-de-sac and the diplomacy of the PTA were transferable to contexts where they had a monetary value. She sat in her kitchen after the last guest left and added up the evening sales on a notepad. The number was modest. The information it represented was not. She would go on to host 4 more parties over the next 2 years before her interests moved elsewhere. But she never forgot the feeling of running the room, the particular satisfaction of being competent in public, of having a function that was visible and valued and acknowledged in the moment. It was different from running the house. It was different from the morning routine and the 6 o'clock dinner and the phone on the kitchen wall. It had an audience that could see her, and she had, it turned out, been waiting for that for quite some time. It seems obvious now, but there was a period, not ancient history, actual recent history, when driving was understood to be something a husband did when he was present, and when he wasn't, you made arrangements. Then, gradually, it became just a thing she did, alone, in the station wagon that technically belonged to both of them, but sat in the driveway from 9 to 5 every weekday waiting for her. She drove to the grocery store, to the school, to the part-time job, to the Wednesday group, to the library, to her mother's, to the dentist, and occasionally to nowhere in particular, because she wanted to listen to the radio for 20 minutes without anyone asking her anything. The car was freedom in a form nobody had flagged as suspicious, which made it extraordinarily useful. The station wagon was a 1970 Ford Country Squire, with the fake wood panelling on the sides that was everywhere in that decade, as if the suburbs were trying to convince themselves they were still adjacent to a forest. It got poor mileage and handled corners with the enthusiasm of a large boat, but it started reliably and had enough room in the back for groceries, children, or the occasional piece of furniture she had decided to acquire without advanced discussion. She had her own key on her own keyring. This had not always been true. The car changed the geometry of her life in ways that were practical and ways that were not. Practically, she could go places when she needed to without coordinating with another adult, which sounds basic because it is basic, and which was nonetheless genuinely new. Before the car was routinely hers, errands required timing, waiting for the weekend, asking to be dropped somewhere and picked up, calibrating her needs against his schedule. The car collapsed all of that. She needed something at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. She got in the car. But the less practical change was the one that mattered more. The car gave her a room of her own that moved. Virginia Woolf had written about the room. the necessity of a private space for a woman to think and work, and the car was not exactly what Woolf had in mind, but it rhymed with it in a specifically 1970s American way. It was a space that was hers while she was in it, insulated from the claims of the house, containing only herself and the radio, and wherever she was going. The radio in the early 1970s was playing something interesting if you let it. She listened to things she would not have chosen at home, because at home choosing what played on the radio was a negotiation she usually lost. In the car she turned the dial herself. She listened to a lot of Carole King, whose album Tapestry had come out in '71 and sold millions of copies to women who recognised in it something about their own interior lives set to piano. She listened to talk radio occasionally and found it both informative and infuriating, which meant it was working. She sat in the school pickup line with the radio on and let herself have opinions about things. She drove herself to the night class. She drove herself to the Wednesday group. She drove herself to a job interview she had not mentioned at home until she'd already been and had a good feeling about it. She drove herself at the end of a long Friday to a parking lot overlooking a park and sat there for 20 minutes doing nothing at all. And then she drove herself home and made dinner, and nobody knew where she'd been or that she'd needed it. The car kept her secrets and asked for nothing in return except occasional gas, which came from the envelope in the second drawer. She thought sometimes that the station wagon with the fake wood panelling was one of the most important things she had ever had. She never said this out loud. It would have sounded disproportionate. It wasn't. The community college catalogue came in the mail in the fall of 1972, and she read the whole thing at the kitchen table while waiting for the dryer to finish. She circled Introduction to Psychology in pencil. Then she erased it. Then she circled it again, and also circled something called Women in American Society, which had only been added to the catalogue that year, and which she attended on Tuesday evenings in a classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and possibility. She was the oldest person there by 8 years, and the only one who had packed her own dinner in a Tupperware container, which made 2 women in the front row think she was extremely organised, and 1 woman in the back row think she was an icon. Community colleges in the early 1970s were quietly becoming something important, accessible, affordable, and increasingly populated by people who had not gone directly from high school to a 4-year degree for any number of reasons, including the reason of having been a woman in the 1950s or 60s, when the path from graduation to college had been paved mainly for other people. She was not the only woman her age in the building, though she was among the minority. There were others, in other classrooms on other evenings, who had come back for the same unspoken reasons, who had circled things in catalogues and erased them, and circled them again, and finally put the catalogue in the car and driven to enrolment. Women in American society met on Tuesday evenings from 7 to 9:30. The professor was a woman in her late 30s who had written her dissertation on the history of women's labour, and who taught with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for this course to be allowed to exist. She assigned reading that was not comfortable. She asked questions that did not have tidy answers. She ran the classroom as a space where the students' own experiences were treated as legitimate evidence, which was a pedagogical approach that several of the younger students found unusual, and which she, who had a decade of lived evidence to draw on, found immediately and deeply validating. She did the reading every week at the kitchen table after everyone was in bed. She read with a pencil and made notes in the margins in small, careful handwriting, questions, objections, moments of recognition, things she wanted to bring to class. She had not done this since she was 20, and the sensation of it was strange and good. Like using a muscle she had been careful not to use for years in case using it made something worse. She was good in the class. This surprised her less as the semester went on. She had opinions that were grounded in experience, the ability to articulate them clearly. and enough life behind her to put the reading in context in ways the 20-year-olds in the front row could not yet do. The professor called on her regularly. She answered. The 20-year-olds took notes. She drove home on Tuesday nights in the dark through the quiet suburb with its lit windows and its sleeping children, and she felt not happy exactly, though she was happy, but something more structural than happy. She felt like herself in a way that was distinct from how she felt in the kitchen and the car and the cul-de-sac, like a version of herself that had been waiting in the catalogue, circled in pencil, erased, circled again. She enrolled in 2 courses the following semester. She told her husband she was thinking about finishing her degree. He said that was fine. She'd already decided it was. In the 1970s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America, and a significant portion of those prescriptions were written for women. This was not a coincidence. The medical establishment had a diagnosis for women who were anxious, restless, dissatisfied, or otherwise exhibiting signs of being conscious, and the prescription was sedation. She had a bottle in the medicine cabinet that she took as directed for a while, and then she read an article, and then she talked to the woman from the Wednesday group who had stopped taking hers, and then she had a conversation with her doctor that he seemed unprepared for, and then she started looking into whether what she felt was a chemical imbalance, or just what happened when a person's life did not fit the shape they'd been poured into. The Rolling Stones had called it Mother's Little Helper in 1966, which is either a cutting observation or an extremely on-the-nose band name for a pharmaceutical trend, depending on your perspective. By the early 1970s, diazepam, Valium was being prescribed at a rate that suggested either an epidemic of anxiety disorders or a medical system that had found a chemical solution to a social problem and was applying it liberally. Women received approximately twice as many prescriptions as men, which the medical literature of the time explained in terms of female biology, and which later scholarship would explain in terms of what happens when you tell half the population that their dissatisfaction is a symptom. She had gone to her doctor in the late 60s feeling tired and tightly wound, and vaguely like something was wrong that she couldn't name, and he had listened for about 4 minutes and written the prescription in the same breath as his recommendation that she try to rest more, which was advice so contextually absurd that she had almost laughed. She filled the prescription because she trusted the doctor, because she was tired, and because the bottle had an official label on it that suggested the problem had a solution. The Valium worked in the way that sedation works. It turned the volume down. The anxiety receded. The tightly wound feeling loosened. She moved through her days with less friction, which was a relief until it wasn't, until she noticed that the friction had also contained information, that the restlessness she'd been medicating was not a malfunction, but a message, that she was anxious and dissatisfied for reasons that a benzodiazepine was not going to address. The woman from the Wednesday group had reached the same conclusion 6 months earlier, had stopped taking hers, and had described the experience as initially terrible and ultimately clarifying. She had said, "I needed to feel what I actually felt." It was not a fun sentence. It was a true one. She went back to her doctor, a different doctor this time, a woman she'd found through a recommendation, and had a different conversation, one in which her dissatisfaction was treated as a subject worth exploring rather than a symptom worth suppressing. It was the first medical appointment in years at which she had felt like a person rather than a presenting complaint. She tapered off the Valium slowly and felt things she had not felt clearly in a while, including the specific restlessness that had sent her to the doctor in the first place, which she now recognized not as anxiety in the clinical sense, but as the feeling of a life that needed to change. It was uncomfortable. It was also, in the most literal sense, useful. She was not broken. She was just becoming. There was one woman, usually one woman, who said the thing clearly, without softening it, without the apologetic laugh that usually came before anything honest. She met her at a PTA meeting or a block party or a night class or a Wednesday group, and within 40 minutes of knowing her, she had said 3 things that were more true than most things she had heard in years. They started meeting for coffee on Thursday mornings, and the coffee ran long, and she drove home afterwards slightly altered, the way you feel after someone shows you a door in a wall you'd assumed was solid. That friendship did not fix anything exactly, but it made certain things possible that had not been possible before, which is sometimes what friendship is actually for. The friend, call her Carol, call her Sandra, call her the one she still talks to 40 years later, had a quality that was rare in the suburb's social landscape, which was that she said what she thought without the 3 layers of protective qualification that everyone else used. She did not say I could be wrong, but, or maybe this is just me before every sentence. She just said the thing, which felt initially startling and eventually like the conversational equivalent of drinking water after years of something more diluted. They had met in the fall of 72 at a school event that she had not wanted to attend, and had attended anyway because opting out required a justification she didn't have. The friend had been standing near the refreshments with the specific expression of someone who was also there against her better judgment, and they had exchanged a look across the table that communicated all of this in about 3 seconds, and then they had talked for an hour and a half and left before the event officially ended, and neither of them apologized for it. What made the friendship different from the other friendships? The warm, real ones built on proximity and shared season, was its honesty about the central subject. They talked about their lives not in the register of management and endurance, but in the register of examination. They asked each other questions that the other friendships didn't have room for. Are you happy? Not are you fine? Not are you managing? Are you happy? And if not, what would need to be different? These are not small questions. In the suburb, in the early 1970s, they were almost radical. She said things to the friend that she'd not said to anyone else, including the Wednesday group, including herself, fully, in the clear light of a Thursday morning. She said that she was not sure she had ever made a real decision, one that was entirely hers, that wasn't shaped by what someone else expected or what the moment seemed to require. She said this, and the friend did not reassure her or minimize it or tell her it was better than she thought. The friend said, "I know, me too." And then, "So what do you want to do about it?" That question, "So what do you want to do about it?" was the most useful thing anyone asked her during that decade. Not because it had an immediate answer, but because it introduced the premise that there was something to do, that the situation was not fixed, that she was not just living inside her life, but could, in some meaningful sense, direct it. She drove home from the diner on Thursday mornings thinking about the question. She was still thinking about it, in various forms for years. She'd started painting in the garage on weekend afternoons, which her husband found charming in the way that things are charming when they seem harmless. She was good, which surprised her more than it surprised anyone else, because nobody had ever organised a context in which she might find that out. By the second year she was showing work at a local gallery, and by the third she was selling it. Not for life-changing amounts of money, but for real money. Money that represented a stranger's decision that her perception of the world was worth something. She did not know what to do with that feeling. She kept painting anyway. She had not painted since high school, where an art teacher had told her she had a good eye, and she had filed the compliment in the category of things people say and moved on. She bought the supplies at a craft store in the fall of 1971, partly because the Wednesday group had been talking about doing things for yourself without needing a reason, and partly because she had been standing in the craft store aisle, and the colours had looked like something she needed to touch. She set up in the garage on a folding table and felt for the first 3 sessions completely ridiculous. Then something happened, as things do when you keep showing up for them. The work started to cohere. She was painting the suburb initially, the cul-de-sac, the back fence, the kitchen window from outside looking in a style that was realist but slightly off, slightly pressurized, like the everyday objects were holding more than they were showing, which they were because she was the one painting them. A neighbour came by one Saturday afternoon, looked at the canvas propped against the garage wall, and said that it made her feel something she couldn't name. She said thank you and mixed more paint, and that was the whole review, and it was enough. The gallery showing had been the friend's idea, the Thursday morning friend, who had seen the work and said without preamble that it needed to be somewhere people could see it. She had objected on multiple grounds, all of which the friend had dismissed with the efficiency of someone who had expected the objections and found them unconvincing. She submitted 3 pieces to a small local gallery that showed regional artists. All 3 were accepted. She attended the opening in a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, and stood in a room where strangers looked at things she had made and had responses to them. One woman stood in front of the kitchen window painting for a long time, and then turned and asked if it was for sale. She said yes before she decided to say yes, and then the painting was sold, and she drove home with a cheque that was modest and enormous, and she sat in the driveway for longer than usual. Her husband asked how it went. She said, "I sold one." He said that was wonderful, and he meant it, and she believed him. And it was still somehow a private thing. The cheque. The woman standing in front of the painting. The feeling of a stranger choosing to take something she had seen into her home. That part was hers alone. She framed it internally and has kept it there ever since. It did not always end in divorce. Sometimes it ended in a conversation, or a series of conversations that were uncomfortable and necessary, and rearranged certain things that had calcified over years of assumption. She'd married a man who was not a villain, just a man of his time, which meant he had certain expectations so thoroughly built into his understanding of reality that he had never examined them because examining them had never been required. The renegotiation was not clean or fast. It involved at least 2 evenings that could reasonably be called fights, and one long Sunday afternoon where they both said things that had needed saying for years, and a period afterward of figuring out what the marriage looked like now that it was being run by 2 people who had both said what they needed. He was, by any reasonable measure, a decent man. He worked hard. He was not unkind. He showed up to the things that were expected of him, and to some that weren't, and he loved her in the way that people love things they have stopped actively seeing, which is to say, genuinely and without much attention. That last part was not cruelty. It was just what happened when 2 people built a life together and then got busy living it and forgot to keep looking at each other. She had been changing, quietly and steadily, for several years before he fully noticed. The night class, the job, the envelope, the Wednesday group, the Thursday friend, the paintings in the garage, each of these things had altered her in small ways that accumulated into something larger, and he'd registered the accumulation without identifying its source, the way you register a change in temperature without immediately locating the open window. The first real conversation happened on a Saturday night in the fall of 73, after something small that was not actually about the small thing. She told him about the graduate school letter, not hers, the woman from the Wednesday groups, and then, almost without planning to, hers. The class she'd been taking, the degree she was thinking about finishing, the job she had not asked his permission for. She said these things not accusatorily but plainly, as a person reporting the current state of her interior to someone who had a right to know it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked why she hadn't told him. The question, why she hadn't told him, was the real beginning of the renegotiation, because answering it honestly required naming the assumption that had been running silently in the background of the marriage for years, that her life outside the house was something that required his approval, that his approval might not be given, that the safer course had been to do and then report rather than ask. She said this as gently as she could. He heard it. He didn't like hearing it. He sat with it for a week and then came back and said he understood what she meant, and that he had not meant for things to work that way, and that he wanted to know what she needed. That conversation did not fix everything. It opened a longer process, months of adjustment, of small negotiations, of him learning to ask and her learning to answer before the fact rather than after. It was imperfect and sometimes frustrating, and the marriage that came out of it was different from the one that had gone in. It was also, both of them eventually agreed, better. Not easier, better. Which are not the same thing, and which she had come to understand, over the course of this decade, were not required to be. And sometimes it did end in divorce, which in the early 1970s was becoming, for the first time, something a woman could initiate without it being treated as an act of personal catastrophe. No-fault divorce laws were spreading state by state through the decade, quietly changing the legal landscape of what she was allowed to do. She was not always doing fine afterward, at least not immediately. There was financial difficulty, social awkwardness, the particular loneliness of being the first person in the cul-de-sac to have her name on a lease. But there was also, and she noticed this despite everything, a specific quality of Tuesday morning that had not existed before, a quiet that was fully hers, a day that would go wherever she pointed it, an absence of the particular weight of managing someone else's comfort from the moment she woke up. California passed the first no-fault divorce law in 1969, and by the mid-70s most states had followed or were following. Before no-fault, divorce required proving fault, adultery, abandonment, cruelty, which meant that a woman who wanted to leave a marriage that was simply wrong for her, that was not abusive or adulterous but was just deeply, structurally incompatible with who she was becoming, had limited legal options. No-fault changed this. It said, "It is enough that the marriage is broken. You do not have to prove that someone broke it." This was a significant sentence. She had known the marriage was wrong before she had the legal vocabulary for ending it. She had known it the way you know something that is true and inconvenient at the same time, known it and then arranged her days around not fully knowing it, because the alternative was a process she could not yet see clearly, and a future she could not yet imagine. The women's movement had given her two things: language for what she was experiencing, and evidence in the form of other women who had done it, that the future was survivable. The divorce was difficult in the ways that divorces are difficult, and some ways that were specific to her moment. Money was the most concrete problem. She'd been out of the full-time workforce for years. She had the part-time job, and the envelope, and the check from the painting, and these were real and not enough. She got a lawyer, which cost money she didn't have, and she got a settlement, which was less than she needed, and she found a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town. That was not the suburb and was affordable, and had a parking lot where she could keep the station wagon, which she'd gotten in the settlement, and which she had been very clear about getting. The social dimension was its own particular texture. People in the cul-de-sac did not know what to do with her. Some were warm and others became suddenly unavailable, which told her things about those friendships that were useful if painful to know. Her children adjusted with the resilience of children, which is to say imperfectly and eventually. Her mother had opinions that she expressed at length. She listened to them with more patience than she felt, and then went home to her apartment, which was small and entirely hers, and sat in the kitchen that she had furnished herself from nothing, and drank coffee that she had made for one. That Tuesday morning she'd noticed, the quiet, the unallocated day did not come all at once. It came in increments between difficult things, as a signal that the difficult things were worth it. She was not happy in the simple sense. She was, in a more complicated sense, becoming the person she'd been circling for years, the one in the catalogue circled in pencil. She was getting somewhere. It was hard and it was hers, and she drove the station wagon wherever she needed to go. The 1970s were, aesthetically speaking, a decade undergoing a minor identity crisis, and she was participating fully. The shirtwaist dresses of the previous decade were giving way to something looser, something with wider legs and bolder prints, something that did not require a girdle to be presentable in public, which she'd worn for years and which, when she finally stopped, felt like putting down something very heavy that she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. She discovered wide-leg trousers. She discovered that her hair looked better when she stopped setting it, and just let it do what it wanted. None of this was nothing. All of it was something. The girdle deserves a moment of specific attention, because it is one of the more literal metaphors available to the decade. It was a garment whose entire purpose was to compress the body into a shape considered more acceptable than the one it arrived in naturally, to hold things in, smooth things down, present an exterior that conformed to a standard the body had not volunteered for. Women had been wearing versions of this for generations. She had been wearing hers since she was 19. When she stopped, in the early 1970s, she did so without announcement, the way you stop doing things that you have gradually recognised as unnecessary, one morning simply not putting it on and finding that nothing terrible happened. The clothing of the early 70s was, taken as a whole, a decade negotiating between what it had been and what it was becoming. The neat, controlled silhouettes of the 60s, the structured A-lines, the white gloves, the hair lacquered into shapes that would not move in wind, were loosening into something more relaxed and occasionally more chaotic. Wide-leg trousers appeared, maxi skirts appeared, fabrics got bolder, prints got louder, and the general aesthetic shifted from precision towards something that looked more like a person who had decided how they wanted to look and then done it. She found her way into this gradually, through accumulation rather than transformation. A pair of wide-leg trousers she had bought on an impulse that turned out to be a good impulse, a blouse in a colour she would not have chosen 5 years earlier, a coat she had seen in a magazine that had been running the articles she read twice, purchased without consulting anyone, worn to the night class, complimented by the Thursday friend. She was not constructing a statement. She was just, incrementally, dressing like herself rather than like the role. The hair was its own chapter. She'd been setting it for years, rolling it, sitting under the dryer, pinning and shaping and producing a result that looked, to her eye, like a performance of a woman rather than a woman. The natural hair movement of the late 60s and early 70s was primarily about something else, something more politically urgent, but it coincided with a broader cultural shift in which the labour required to maintain a highly controlled appearance was beginning to be named as labour, as a demand on women's time and money and physical comfort that served primarily to signal compliance with a standard they had not written. She stopped setting her hair in the spring of 72 and wore it as it was, which was wavy and somewhat determined, and nobody said anything negative, and she felt considerably better. Dressing for no one in particular, she discovered, was dressing for herself, which sounds circular and is not. There is a difference between clothing chosen to meet an external standard and clothing chosen because you looked in the mirror and thought, yes, that is the one. The second kind requires knowing what you think, which requires having had enough time inside your own head to form preferences that are actually yours. She had been accumulating that time, in increments, all decade. By the mid-70s, she knew what she thought. She dressed accordingly. She had voted before, but voting and paying attention are different activities. She started paying attention somewhere around the second or third Wednesday group meeting, when it became clear that the things they were talking about in that living room had names, had legislation attached, had women who were working professionally to make them real. She read about the Equal Rights Amendment. She read about Title IX. She watched the Roe v. Wade decision come down in 1973, and sat with the complexity of what it meant, not just as policy, but as a statement about whose decisions, about whose body belonged to whom. She was not a radical, by her own description. She was just a woman who had started finding certain conversations unavoidable. The Equal Rights Amendment had been introduced into Congress in every session since 1923, which is a fact that contains within it an entire history of how slowly certain kinds of change move, and how persistently certain kinds of people push for them anyway. By 1972 it had finally passed both houses of Congress, and was moving through state ratifications, and for a brief period it looked like it might actually happen, like the Constitution might be amended to state plainly that equality of rights under the law could not be denied on the basis of sex. She followed this through the news and through Ms. Magazine and through conversations with a Thursday friend who had strong and well-sourced opinions about it. Title IX had passed in 1972, quietly and without the cultural attention it would later receive. At the time, she read about it primarily in the context of education. The provision that federally funded educational programs could not discriminate on the basis of sex, and thought about her daughter, who was 9 and who ran faster than most of the boys in her class and had no organised sport available to her at school. She thought about what it would mean for her daughter to have access to the things she herself had not had access to. She thought about this quite a lot. Roe versus Wade was different in texture. It landed in January of 73 while she was still finding her footing in the night class, still early in the renegotiation of the marriage, still in the process of becoming someone who had opinions she'd formed herself. The decision was complex, and she sat with its complexity as a matter of law, as a matter of bodily autonomy, as a statement about whose authority extended over whose most private decisions. She was not certain of everything she felt about it. She was certain of the principle at its centre, which was that a woman's body was hers to make decisions about, and that this principle had been contested for so long and so hard that a Supreme Court decision affirming it was both necessary and should not have needed to be. She did not become an activist. She did not carry signs or organise chapters or run for office, though she knew women who did all of these things and thought they were brave. What she did was vote with information, speak with specificity, and refuse the comfortable position of treating politics as something that happened elsewhere to other people. Her life was political. Her morning routine was political. The envelope in the second drawer was political. The credit card in her own name, which she had been able to get after 1974, was political. None of this required a placard. All of it required paying attention. She had started paying attention. She did not stop. For most of her adult life, her relationship with her body had been primarily administrative. It was something to be maintained at an acceptable standard, not too large, not too bold, not too anything, arranged into shapes that were pleasing without calling attention to the effort. Then she read Our Bodies, Ourselves, which had been published in 1970 by a group of women in Boston who had gotten tired of doctors speaking to them like they were not in the room, and which contained information about her own anatomy that nobody had provided in any formal context during her entire education. She read it at the kitchen table in the afternoon, and periodically said to herself, quietly, things along the lines of, well, nobody told me that. Our Bodies, Ourselves had started as a pamphlet, produced by a group of women in Boston who called themselves the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, and who had begun meeting in 1969 to talk about their experiences with a medical system that was, to put it plainly, not designed around them. Doctors spoke to them as though their bodies were objects to be managed by professionals, rather than inhabited by persons. Information was withheld on the premise that they wouldn't understand it, or didn't need it. Their own experiences were routinely dismissed in favour of the doctor's interpretation of those experiences. The collective decided to fix this by researching everything themselves and writing it down in language that was clear and direct, and assumed the reader was an intelligent adult, which was a more radical publishing decision than it sounds. She had borrowed the book from the Thursday friend, who had acquired it through the kind of informal distribution network that important things travel through when official channels aren't moving them. It was a thick paperback with small type and frank line drawings, and chapters on subjects that nobody had ever discussed with her plainly: her reproductive anatomy, her hormonal cycle, contraception, pregnancy, menopause, the experience of medical care as a woman, the history of that experience and why it was the way it was. She read it in sections over 2 weeks, and each section produced a specific variant of the same feeling. The feeling of information arriving that should have arrived much earlier. The chapter on the medical system was the one she kept returning to. It named the dynamic she had experienced in the doctor's office, the one who had written the Valium prescription in 4 minutes without asking much, as a systemic pattern rather than an individual failure. It connected her personal experience of being not quite seen in medical contexts to a longer history of women's bodies being treated as medical territory that belonged to the professionals managing it, rather than to the women living in it. She read this and thought about every medical appointment she'd ever had, every time she'd said "I think" and been redirected, every prescription written before the conversation was finished. She went to a different doctor, the woman doctor she'd found through recommendation, and brought questions. Real questions, written in a small notebook she had started carrying to appointments. The doctor answered them. She asked follow-up questions. The appointment ran long, and she did not apologise for it. She drove home differently than she had driven to medical appointments before, with the particular quality of someone who has been recognised as a participant in their own care rather than a recipient of it. She scheduled a follow-up. She brought the notebook. She kept asking. He took the kids to a Little League game, and she had from 10 until 2, which was 4 hours, which was the longest she'd been alone in the house since she couldn't remember when. She sat down first, just to sit, which took about 12 minutes before it started feeling normal rather than suspicious. Then she made herself a lunch that was entirely what she wanted and nothing else. She read. She put on music at a volume slightly higher than was necessary. She lay on the couch without any particular purpose for 30 minutes, which she was aware was technically available to her any afternoon, but which, without explanation, was much easier to do when she had the house and didn't have to be available to account for it. The 4 hours were a different kind of time than the 6 hours she had on weekdays between the bus and the pickup. The weekday hours had structure imposed on them, the work of the house, the errands, the phone, the sequence of tasks that filled the time whether she wanted them to or not. The Saturday hours had no structure except what she gave them, which was both the point and the difficulty, because she had spent so long operating inside externally imposed structure that having 4 unscheduled hours felt initially like a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be used. She solved it by doing nothing first, which is the correct approach and the one that takes the most practice. She made coffee, real coffee, enough for herself, in no hurry, and sat at the kitchen table and let the house be quiet around her. She did not make a list. She did not plan dinner. She did not assess the state of the laundry situation or think about what needed doing in the yard. She just sat, and the sitting gradually became comfortable, and the comfortable became something close to luxurious, and the luxurious became ordinary in the way that good things become ordinary when you let them. Lunch was a tomato sandwich with too much mayonnaise and a glass of iced tea, which was exactly what she wanted and would not have made if anyone else had been there to have an opinion about it. She ate it at the kitchen table, reading the book she was in the middle of. She did not get up once for anyone else's anything. She finished 2 chapters. She went back for more iced tea. The afternoon had the quality of a country she had always known existed and rarely been allowed to visit. The music was the Tapestry album, because it was always the Tapestry album, and also some Carly Simon, and a record she had bought at the night class book sale that turned out to be a folk singer from Vermont she had never heard of and liked immediately. She played it loud enough that it filled the room, and would have been annoying to someone else and was not annoying to her. She sang along to the parts she knew and listened carefully to the parts she didn't. She danced briefly in the kitchen, which she would not have described as dancing if anyone had asked, but which was. At 1:50, she started thinking about what time they'd be back, and the 4 hours began to close, and she felt the familiar pivot back toward availability. But she had had it. She had had 4 hours of herself, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, precisely what she'd been learning to ask for all decade. Not a revolution, not a transformation, just a Saturday morning that belonged to her. She was getting better at taking it. She intended to keep getting better. She didn't think of herself as modelling anything. She was just living, which was all anyone could do. But her daughters were watching with a specific attentiveness of people who are going to need this information. They watched her go back to school and not die. They watched her get a job and not collapse the household. They watched her argue with their father and then make dinner and then argue again and then figure it out. None of which was comfortable, all of which was real. They watched her become incrementally a more complete version of herself, which is not a thing children always get to observe, and they filed it in some part of themselves that wouldn't be accessed for another decade, when they would need it. Children are documentary filmmakers with unlimited access and no editorial agenda. They record everything, process it slowly, and retrieve it precisely when it becomes relevant to their own lives, which is usually in their late 20s over a phone call they hadn't planned on making. They watched her in the kitchen, and in the car, and in the conversation she thought they weren't listening to. They watched her leave for the night class in a coat that was hers. They watched her come home from the gallery the night she sold the painting. They watched her sit at the kitchen table with a book and a pencil and not be available for 20 minutes, which she had started enforcing, and which they had initially resisted and then accepted and then, without knowing it, incorporated into their understanding of what a mother was allowed to be. The older daughter was 12 when the decade started and 22 when it ended, which meant she watched the whole arc from an age of awareness, with the specific comprehension of a child old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to be shaped by it. She watched her mother stop wearing the girdle and start wearing the trousers, and thought nothing of it consciously, but stored it as data about what women's bodies were allowed to be. She watched her mother go to the night class and come home with books that had pencil marks in the margins, and stored it as data about what women's minds were allowed to do. She watched her mother sell a painting to a stranger, and stored it as data about what women's work was worth. The younger daughter was 7 in 1970 and 17 at the decade's end, old enough to have grown up inside the changes rather than watching them happen to someone else. She had a mother who had a job, who had a night class, who had a checking account in her own name, who had argued with her father and worked it out, who had made a decision about her own medical care and stood in a gallery next to her own work. These things were not remarkable to the younger daughter because they had always been there. They were just what a woman was. That was the whole point. She did not give them speeches. She did not sit them down and explain what she was doing or why. She just did it, in front of them, with the imperfection and uncertainty, an occasional visible difficulty of someone figuring things out in real time. That imperfection was the important part, not a flawless example, but a real one, a woman visibly in the process of becoming, which told them something a finished version never could, that the process was possible, that it was allowed, that you could be in the middle of it and still be their mother, still make the dinner, still be loved and loving, still be okay. They called her, in their late 20s, over phone calls they hadn't planned on making. They said, "I've been thinking about what you did." They said, "I didn't understand it then." They said, "Thank you." She said you're welcome and meant it more than she could explain, because she had not done it for them, she had done it for herself, and the fact that it had been a gift to them anyway was the kind of thing that made the whole difficult decade feel like it had been organised by someone who knew what they were doing. She did not march, she did not give speeches, she did not write manifestos or file lawsuits or run for office. But she did, in the course of the 1970s, do approximately 400 small things that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, and that she did not announce or explain. She opened a checking account in her own name. She got a credit card in her own name, which had legally required her husband's permission until 1974, when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed and suddenly did not. She made a decision about her own medical care without consulting anyone first. She said no to something she'd been saying yes to for years, and then she said it again, and it stayed said. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 is not a piece of legislation that appears in many textbooks, and it should appear in more. Before it passed, a woman, married or single, could be denied credit on the basis of her sex. Banks could require a husband's signature on a wife's credit application. A divorced or widowed woman could find that the credit history she'd built jointly with her husband did not legally belong to her. The law changed this. It said, women are credit-worthy persons whose financial lives belong to them. She applied for her own card within 6 months of the Act's passage and received it and put it in her wallet and did not make a large speech about it. She just had it. It was hers. The checking account had come earlier, in 72, opened at a bank branch on a Tuesday afternoon, when she had her own money from her own job and nowhere to put it that was entirely hers. The bank officer had been slightly uncertain about the paperwork, not obstructive, just visibly operating without a well-worn procedure, and she had waited with the patience of someone who had been patient her entire life and would be patient for the duration of this transaction, and then she would have the account. She had the account. She deposited her first check into it and kept the receipt. The no, the thing she had been saying yes to for years and then stopped, was different for every woman and the same in kind. For her it was a committee she'd been serving on at the church since '68, which had been absorbing approximately 6 hours a month of her time in ways that were not particularly meaningful to her, and had been organised on the premise that her time was available because she was home. When she resigned, the woman who called to ask if she was sure cited the committee's dependence on her. She said she understood that and was still resigning. She was thanked for her service. She thanked them back. She did not feel guilty, which was itself a small revolution. These things, the account, the card, the no, had no audience. They generated no coverage, no acknowledgement, no record. They were entirely internal adjustments in the architecture of her daily life, invisible from the outside, seismic from the inside. They were the work that the larger movements made possible, the translation of legislative and cultural change into the specific lived texture of one woman's Tuesday. The history books would remember the marches and the legislation and the landmark cases. She did not need the history books. She had the receipt from the first deposit. She had the card in her wallet. She had the Tuesday afternoon when she didn't go to the committee meeting and went to the night class instead, and the house stood, and the world kept turning, and she was fine. Mary Richards threw her hat in the air in Minneapolis in 1970, and something changed in the cultural air. Nothing dramatic, just a slight shift in pressure, a new note in the frequency. She watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show on Friday evenings and found it quietly radical in a way she couldn't have fully articulated. A single woman with a job and an apartment and opinions and a life that was genuinely her own, presented not as a tragedy or a cautionary tale but as a premise. She watched Maud make decisions about her own body in prime time in 1972 and felt the particular shock of seeing something on television that had previously only existed in private conversations. The television was telling her something. She was listening. Television in the early 1970s was in the middle of what television historians would later call the socially relevant era, a period when the networks, responding to cultural pressure and audience demographics, began airing programming that engaged directly with the changes happening in American life, rather than papering over them with situation comedies about cheerful families in which nothing real ever occurred. All in the Family had premiered in 1971 and rattled the country by depicting a bigot sympathetically, which was either brave or complicated depending on your position. The Mary Tyler Moore Show had premiered the year before and was doing something different, quieter, more personal, more specifically about a woman navigating a world that had not been built around her expectations. Mary Richards was not a revolutionary. She was a 30-something single woman with a job in television news who had opinions about her work and her life, and who navigated the competing demands of professional ambition and social expectation with humour and imperfect grace. She was not a symbol, at least not intentionally. She was just a person, which was itself the point. A woman on television who was just a person, whose story was not organised around a husband or a romantic resolution, whose life was the show rather than the backdrop to someone else's show. She watched every episode. Maud arrived in 1972, a spin-off that was louder and more abrasive and entirely deliberate about its subject matter. Maud Findlay was 50, twice divorced, politically liberal, and uninterested in performing pleasantness she didn't feel. She argued. She was wrong sometimes, and right other times, and almost never quiet. When Maud had an abortion in a 2-part episode in the fall of 1972, 3 months before Roe v. Wade, the network received thousands of complaints, and the episode aired anyway, and she watched both parts and sat very still during the credits. There was also, later in the decade, One Day at a Time, a divorced mother raising 2 daughters alone, managing money and work and her own identity in real time in a small apartment, without a husband to organise the narrative around. The show was less polished than Mary Tyler Moore, and more directly about the texture of actual life, and she found it harder to watch and more useful. She watched it on Tuesday nights when she got home from the class, and the kids were in bed, and she sat on the couch with her shoes off, and the television said, "This is real. This is happening. You are not alone in this." She already knew that by then. It was still good to hear. She was not. The same woman she'd been in 1968, which was probably the last time she'd had occasion to ask herself who she was without the answer being primarily relational. Wife, mother, neighbour, volunteer. She was becoming something harder to summarise, which was uncomfortable but also, she thought, more accurate. She had opinions she'd formed herself, from reading things and talking to people, and sitting with questions long enough for her own answers to surface. She had work she was proud of, or a skill she'd developed, or a friendship built on honesty rather than proximity. She was not done. She was nowhere near done. But she was in motion, which was a different condition than she'd been in before, and she was not interested in stopping. Identity is not a thing you find. Despite everything the 1970s told you about finding yourself, which was a phrase that appeared in magazines and self-help books, and conversations with relative frequency during this decade, and which contained a premise she had come to think was slightly wrong. You did not find yourself, as if the self were a fixed object mislaid somewhere and recoverable with sufficient searching. You made yourself continuously through the decisions you made and the things you paid attention to, and the people you were honest with and the work you kept showing up for. The making was ongoing. It did not complete. What she had been doing all decade without naming it as such was making herself. The night class was making, the job was making, the envelope, the Wednesday group, the Thursday friend, the painting in the garage, the no to the committee, the credit card in her own name. Each one was a small act of construction, a piece added to something that had always been there but had not previously had room to take its full shape. She was not inventing herself from nothing. She was finishing something that had been started decades earlier and interrupted by the logistics of the life she'd been asked to live. The woman she was becoming was harder to describe than the woman she had been, because the woman she had been had a clear social function that described her adequately. Wife, mother, neighbour, volunteer. The woman she was becoming had a social function and also an interior, which is not more important than the function but is necessary to the person, and which had been present all along and was finally being given sufficient air. She was becoming someone who finished her own sentences, someone who had a checking account and a credit card and a savings that was separate and entirely hers, someone who had a night class and a part-time job and a painting in a gallery, and a friendship built on the premise that honesty was more important than comfort. Someone who read books with pencil marks in the margins and had opinions about them, and expressed those opinions in classrooms where people took notes. Someone who drove herself places and sat in the car afterward when she needed to. Someone who said no to the committee and yes to herself and was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, to find those two things equally valid. She would not have described herself as transformed. She would have said she was more like herself than she had been, which is a quieter claim and a more precise one. Transformation implies a before and after, with a clear line between them. What she had was a process, long, non-linear, ongoing, involving setbacks and adjustments, and the occasional evening where the old life looked simple in the rear view, and she had to remind herself why she'd left it behind. She was not done. She said this with some satisfaction. There was more to make. She wouldn't have listened, which is the honest answer. Nobody listens to the things they most need to hear before they're ready, which is the fundamental tragedy of advice. But if she could have sat down with the version of herself at 22, the one who was saying yes to everything because yes was what the moment seemed to require, she would have said a few things. That the life that looks safest is not always the one that fits. That needing something different from what you have is not ingratitude. That a quiet life can contain enormous amounts of unexpressed self. And that it is not too late. It was not too late then. It is not too late now to find out who you actually are when the house is quiet and the obligations have cleared and you finally stop moving for long enough to ask the question. She would have told her to finish the degree. Not because the degree was the point, it wasn't exactly, but because the finishing was. Because there is a specific damage done by stopping at the moment someone else's life requires your full attention and never going back. Not because you couldn't, but because you forgot that you were supposed to. Because the years passed and the returning seemed increasingly unlikely. And then one day, you were standing in the kitchen in your housecoat and the degree was 20 years in the past and the catalogue from the community college was in the mailbox. Finish it, she would have said, even if it takes until you're 40. Especially if it takes until you're 40. She would have told her to open the account earlier, to understand at 22 instead of 35 that financial independence was not a luxury or a statement, but a basic condition of personhood. That the ability to act on your own decisions requires the means to act on them, and that the means should be yours and in your name from the beginning. She would have told her that the envelope in the second drawer was a start and not enough, and to make it a proper account as soon as she possibly could, and that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was coming in 74 and she should be ready. She would have told her that the restlessness was not a flaw. This is the one she would have leaned on. The specific restlessness of a capable person operating below their capacity, the vague wrongness that she had been handed a diagnosis for, the symptom that had been medicated rather than listened to, was not a malfunction of her psychology. It was information. It was her actual self making itself known in the only register available to it, which was discomfort, because the comfortable channels had been closed off. She should have listened to it in 1962 instead of in 1973. She lost a decade to not listening. She would tell her younger self, listen earlier. The thing that is wrong is telling you something. Hear it. She would have told her about the Thursday friend, that this kind of friendship exists, that you should find it as soon as possible, that a person who will say the thing clearly without the apologetic laugh is one of the most valuable things in a life, and you should prioritize her the way you prioritize everything else that is essential. She would have said, find that woman, tell her the truth, let her tell you the truth back, this is not small. And finally she would have told her that the life she was going to live, the long middle of it, the casseroles and the harvest gold carpet and the phone on the kitchen wall, was not wasted. That the skills she built in those years, the organisational intelligence, the social fluency, the extraordinary competence at managing complex systems under difficult conditions without recognition or support, were real skills that would be real assets in everything she did afterward. She was not wasted. She was just for a while insufficiently used. There is a difference. She would want her younger self to know that. Then she would let her go, knowing she wouldn't listen, knowing she would need to find all of it herself, knowing that the finding was the point. Some things cannot be handed to you. You have to walk the whole distance yourself and arrive at them on your own. She had walked it. She had arrived. The distance had been long and the arriving had been worth it, and she was still walking. She had not heard of Paulie Murray when she opened her checking account. She had not heard of Shirley Chisholm when she enrolled in the night class. She had not heard of Bella Abzug when she resigned from the church committee, or of Florence Kennedy when she drove herself to the job interview without asking permission first. She learned their names later, through the night class and the magazines and the Thursday friend who arrived at coffee one morning with a list of people she said she needed to know about. She read about them with the specific feeling of someone discovering that the road they had been walking was built by other people, in difficult conditions, long before they arrived on it. Paulie Murray had been arguing for civil rights and women's rights simultaneously since the 1940s, in a legal career that intersected both movements before either had its current shape. She'd written the legal argument that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would later use before the Supreme Court, which is the kind of historical footnote that makes you sit back from the page for a moment. Shirley Chisholm had run for President of the United States in 1972, not symbolically, not as a statement, but as an actual campaign, seeking actual delegates standing at actual podiums, saying plainly that she was the best candidate and the country should consider voting for her. She had not known about this in 72. She found out in 75 and was briefly furious about not knowing sooner. These women, and there were many of them, more than the magazines usually covered, more than the history being written in real time seemed to have room for, had been doing the structural work for decades, filing the lawsuits, drafting the legislation, testifying before committees in rooms where nobody wanted to hear what they had to say, and they said it anyway, with documentation. They had been doing this work while she was standing at the kitchen wall answering the phone, and they had been doing it so that she could eventually stop answering the phone and do something else. She owed them a debt she had not known she was accumulating. She also learned about the women closer to her own experience, the ones who had not made the magazines but had made the local organisations, the women who had founded the chapters of Now in mid-sized cities, who had organised the legal aid clinics for women navigating divorce in states where no fault was new, who had set up the consciousness-raising groups that spread through the suburbs by word of mouth and back fence and telephone call. These women were not famous. They were just persistent, which is frequently more important than famous, and considerably less recognised. She thought about them when she drove to the night class on Tuesday evenings, through the quiet suburb with its lit windows and its sleeping assumptions. Someone had built the road she was driving on. Someone had argued for the right to the credit card in her wallet. Someone had filed the brief that changed the law that allowed her to open the account. Someone had stood in a room decades earlier and said the thing that needed saying to people who did not want to hear it, and had kept standing there until the room changed. She was the beneficiary of that persistence. She'd arrived on a road she had not built, in a decade that had been in construction for much longer than the decade. She started paying that forward in the only way immediately available to her. She told her daughters their names. She told her daughters about Pauli Murray and Shirley Chisholm, and the women in Boston who wrote the book, and the women in living rooms across the country who sat in circles and told the truth. She told them the road had been built by people who were not thanked adequately and were not always remembered, and that the least you could do was know their names and say them out loud. Her daughters listened. They wrote some of them down. That was the beginning of something. She hoped it would continue longer than she would be around to see it. It did not arrive with fanfare. There was no moment of swelling music, no conversation that cracked something open, no single event she could point to afterward and say, that was it. That was the night everything clarified. It arrived the way most important things arrive, which is quietly and slightly sideways, during an ordinary evening that she had not expected to be significant. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the fall of 1976, the children in bed, the house quiet, a cup of tea she'd made for herself going slightly cold beside her book. She looked up for no particular reason, and looked at the room, the kitchen she had not chosen but had made hers, the shelf she had reorganised, the painting she had done herself that was hanging where the calendar used to be, and she thought, I am going to be all right. Not fine, not managing. All right, in the full sense of the word, which is different. She had not been certain of this for most of the decade. The decade had been, among other things, a sustained exercise in uncertainty, in trying things she didn't know she could do, in dismantling arrangements that had seemed permanent, in becoming a person she could not fully picture in advance. Uncertainty of this kind is not comfortable. It is also, she had learned, not the same as danger, though she'd confused the two for years. The feeling of not knowing how something would turn out had always registered as a warning signal, something to be resolved quickly by retreating to the known. She had spent years retreating. Then she had spent years not retreating, and the not retreating had been frightening, and also had turned out fine. Not perfectly fine, not fine without cost, but fine in the sense that she had come through it, and was still herself, and was, in certain measurable ways, more herself than she had been before. She looked at the painting on the wall, one of the cul-de-sac ones, the back fence with the afternoon light coming through it at the angle she had always noticed, and nobody else had seemed to. A stranger had paid money for a painting like it. She'd made it in the garage on a folding table. Both of these things were true simultaneously, which still seemed improbable, and which she intended to keep thinking about. She had a checking account with money in it that she had earned. She had a credit card in her own name. She had finished 9 credits toward a degree she was going to finish, slowly, at the pace the rest of her life allowed, and she had a professor who had written at the bottom of her last paper that she had a strong analytical mind, which she'd read 3 times and then put in the kitchen drawer under the take-out menus, next to where the envelope used to be. She had a Thursday friend who would tell her the truth. She had a Wednesday group that had been meeting for 4 years and had become, over time, something between a support system and a small civilization. She had daughters who were watching her, and a son who was growing up in a house where his mother had a job, and a checking account and a painting on the wall, and opinions she expressed without apology. The tea was cold. She drank it anyway. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet late at night when everyone was asleep, and the suburb had settled into itself, and the only sound was the refrigerator's hum, the avocado green one she had not chosen, which hummed reliably anyway, which had been there through all of it. She was going to be all right. She already was. She got up, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light and went to bed in a life that was, imperfectly and genuinely, and for the first time in a long time, hers. So here you are. At the end of a day that began in 1973, in a split-level ranch in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with a lukewarm cup of coffee and 4 minutes of borrowed quiet before the house made its demands again. You have spent the evening with a woman who did not make the history books. She did not lead a march or argue a case before the Supreme Court or throw her hat in the air in Minneapolis while a camera crew captured it for television. She stood at a kitchen wall and answered a phone. She made 10,000 dinners. She signed permission slips she hadn't read and found shoes that weren't in the same room and kept an envelope in the second drawer that nobody asked about, and inside that envelope was something that looked like grocery money and was actually the first sentence of a paragraph she was learning to write about herself. She was not extraordinary, except in the way that all people are extraordinary when you look closely enough, when you follow them through the ordinary hours and watch what they carry, and notice what it costs them, and see what they build anyway, quietly, without announcement, in the margins of a life that was not entirely of their own design. The 1970s suburban wife has been flattened by history into a type. The harvest gold kitchen, the jello mould, the woman waiting for her husband's car in the driveway. And yes, all of that was real. The carpet was that colour, the casseroles were that beige. But underneath the surface of all that ordinary, something was moving. Something had been moving for a long time and was finally, in this decade, finding room to move openly. She found her room, not all at once, and not without difficulty, and not without the specific grief of looking at a life you have built carefully and asking whether it fits, which is one of the harder questions a person can ask, because the answer requires you to do something about it. She asked. She did something about it. She drove herself to the night class in the country square with the fake wood panelling, and she sat in a classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner, and she wrote in the margins of books that she read by herself at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep, and she became, incrementally and irreversibly, more herself. Her daughters are watching from somewhere in the story, taking notes in the quiet way that children take notes on the most important things. They will call her in their late 20s and say thank you for things she did not know she was giving them. She will say you're welcome and mean it more than she can explain. And you, lying there in your clean bed, in your warm room, with your phone in your own name and your account in your own name and your life arranged, however imperfectly, around your own choices, you're also, in some small way, the daughter of this story. The road was built. You're driving on it. Someone kept the envelope in the second drawer so that you could have the account. Someone said no to the committee so you would know that no was available. Someone drove herself to the interview without asking permission so you would understand that permission was not the architecture of the thing. Tonight, before you sleep, maybe say a quiet thank you to the women who marched and the women who didn't, to the ones who filed the briefs and the ones who just filed their own taxes for the first time, to the ones who made history and the ones who made dinner and the ones who understood somewhere in the middle of a Tuesday in 1973 that those two things were not as different as they seemed. The house is quiet now. The obligations have cleared. The day is done. You're going to be all right. You already are. Good night.